the way of Cain and the error of Balaam. Cain was the firstborn of the human race. His parents were created, but Cain was born. Shortly after Eve bare Cain, she bare his brother Abel. So Cain and Abel grew up together, but they learned separate trades. Cain raised herbs, plants, and Abel raised sheep, goats, you might say flocks. Well, they grew up, and eventually they became separated in more ways than one. Now, let's establish something of a timeline here about how old was Cain when he killed Abel. Well, we get a hint that Seth was born after Cain had killed Abel, and Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old. So we get a hint that perhaps Cain killed Abel just shortly before Seth was born, which would have made Cain about 128 or 129 years old at the time he killed Abel, and Abel would probably have been slightly younger. Now what this means is that the earth's population could have been several thousand by the time that Cain killed Abel. Keep that in mind, because that's going to be important to the rest of the story. Anyway, Cain, when he grew up and chose a place to live in the presence of God. How do we know this? Well, throughout the short narrative, Cain and God were able to talk to each other face to face. Cain would talk to God, and God would answer. This is the type of relationship that none of us can have today, because God no longer dwells on earth the way he did then. Now, I need to clarify. Before the fall, God would come down to earth in the cool of the day and talk to Adam and Eve. Now, it says that Adam and Eve heard the voice of God as God was walking in the garden. It does not say that they saw God. No one has ever seen God. In fact, I don't believe even Adam and Eve could have looked on the face of God and lived. But they heard God's voice. They knew where God was. They might even have had an extra sense that we don't have and felt God's presence. Now, many of us today maybe claim that we feel God's presence, but not in the way that Adam and Eve and Cain did. So Cain placed his dwelling closer to God than anyone else. And you might ask, well, why? Well, for one thing, I am imagining that Adam and Eve wanted to put a distance between themselves and God. Adam and Eve felt the sting of the loss of Eden, the sting of the loss of the eternal life that they would have enjoyed had they not committed sin. Now, to Cain, he did not feel that sting. Oh, he knew that his parents had lost something, but he didn't feel the sting of the loss that his parents did. Well, in his closeness to God, Cain probably found that God was the best friend anyone could want. God did almost everything that Cain asked him to do. Maybe even up to that time, God did everything that Cain asked. And, well, you know, this was a really good relationship. He had the creator of the universe next to him, and man, he felt an awesome sense of power. Yes, no doubt. An awesome sense of glory. Yes, I mean, he dwelt in the presence of God, which later he was to walk away from. But for the time being, he was in the presence of God. But one day, he decided that, hey, now, I've got an idea. I'm going to change things a little bit. After all, my brother Abel is a man of the flock. He let him offer the blood sacrifice, but I'm going to offer grain. I'm going to offer fruit. Now, Cain did not realize that at the time that grain and fruit would not please God, so he offered his offering of grain and fruit, while simultaneously Abel offered of the first of his flock and of the fat of his flock. Well, this did not work out well for Cain. We don't know exactly how God let Cain know that his offering was not accepted, but basically God did not accept Cain's offering, but he did accept Abel's offering. And Cain became very, very angry. His countenance fell. Well, God approached him and said, Cain, why are you angry? And why are you so crestfallen? And Cain probably replied something like, well, you have not accepted my offering, which I made in good faith. You've always done everything for me that I asked, but why couldn't you do this? Well, God said to Cain, now Cain, listen, if you do what I tell you to, everything will go well. But if you don't do right, sin is lying at the door. Sin has a desire to grab a hold of you and to control you and never let you go, but you must overcome your urge to sin. Cain decided, well, I will not give up. I'm going to get God to accept my way anyway. I'm going to first get Abel on my side. So Cain talked to his brother Abel, maybe more than once, and Abel would not agree with Cain. Finally, Cain became so upset that he rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. As far as we know, this was the first murder. Well, God said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? Cain said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? God said to Cain, probably most gently, now Cain, what is it that you have done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and I have to deal with what you have done to your brother. So here's your punishment, Cain. The ground is cursed because of your brother's blood. The ground will never yield again to you what it has yielded before. And furthermore, Cain, you're going to wind up roaming the earth as a fugitive and a vagabond. Cain said back to God, you are punishing me more than I can stand. God, you're kicking me out from the face of the earth. From your face I will be hid. I will be a fugitive and a vagabond, and God, everyone who sees me will kill me. Now, this contained half truth and half not. The punishment, according to Cain, consisted of 4 parts. Part number 1 was, I will be a fugitive and a vagabond. That much was true. But then Cain went on to say, and from your face I will be hidden. That was not true. Cain still wanted to have fellowship with God in spite of his sin, which he could have had. God had not cast Cain forth from his presence. Then the next part, I will be a fugitive and a vagabond. Again, that was true. That was right. Number 3. But number 4, everyone who sees me will try to kill me. This was not what God had authorized. God did not authorize murder to be a capital crime until after the flood. Before the flood, there was no capital punishment as far as we know. So Cain was half right in what he said to God, and he was half wrong. Well, God said back to Cain, now Cain, listen, I'm going to make sure no one kills you, or if anyone does, I will punish him 7 times greater than I've punished you. We don't know what the mark was, but God put a mark on Cain to keep anyone who saw him from killing him. Now, Cain, he was not forced to leave, but he walked away from the presence of the Lord. Cain went and dwelt in the land of Nod, which means the land of wandering, and he was, in fact, what God had said he would be, a fugitive and a vagabond, a wanderer, a man who moved about from place to place. At this point, Cain had a wife, and we may wonder, why did Cain not have a wife before now? After all, he was probably about 129 years old. I have my suspicions that the women of Cain's day did not like three things about him. Number one, he was older than they were and probably excessively bossy. I'm just guessing. That is not in the text. But we do know that he lived close to God, and a lot of women, all down through the ages, have not liked a man who seems to be excessively religious. And yes, Cain must have been very, very religious. And if that weren't enough, maybe these women had what sometimes is called feminine intuition, where that they could sense that, hey, here is a man who is so close to God, and yet something is wrong inside him. He seems to be a man full of hatred and full of anger, and in this the women were right. Anyway, apparently when Cain separated himself from God and put a distance between him and God, at least one woman on the earth liked him. The question has been asked, well, where did Cain get his wife? Well, keep in mind that the number of women on earth at that time probably numbered many thousands, of which there might have been hundreds who were unmarried. So Cain could have his pick from any one of maybe hundreds of women. You might say, wasn't that incest? Well, yes and no. Yes, and that Cain married someone who was close of kin, but Cain could do that. For Cain that was not a sin, because in Cain's day, mankind had perfect DNA. There was no blemish in our DNA, no mutations. So Cain could marry his sister, and they could have normal, healthy children. The practice of incest was not forbidden until the time of Moses, when by the time of Moses, mankind had a whole lot of bad genes, a whole lot of bad DNA, a whole lot of bad mutations, and most all mutations are bad, and therefore a man could not marry his near kin. But in Cain's day it was different. Cain was allowed to marry his near of kin. Anyway, Cain had a son named Enoch. He built a city and called the city Enoch after the name of his son. And Cain became the ancestor of several ungodly generations. I want to say a little bit more about God dwelling on the earth. About 230 years after Adam was created, Adam's grandson Enos was born. And it's said that in Enos' day, man began to call on the name of the Lord. In other words, apparently before that time, mankind had not had to call on the name of the Lord. It almost seems, and some people speculated, that about the time Enos was born, God's presence left the earth, and God went back up into the sky. It was later said that after the flood, a man named Nimrod lifted God back up to the sky, or sent God back up to the sky. And it is said that when the temple was about to be destroyed, after Christ had been crucified and died, that the Shekinah glory left the temple, and they knew that the presence of God left the temple. So there have been some times when God's earthly presence has left us, never to come back. And God's earthly presence has left us, but then God sent his Son, the Messiah, and when the Messiah went back to heaven, he sent the Holy Spirit. So we have a type of relationship that they did not have before the flood or before the coming of the Messiah, but they had the type of relationship with God that we do not have. Anyway, Cain knew God face to face. Perhaps similar to Moses, who it was said that Moses and God talked to each other as a man talks to a friend. But I believe that even in Moses' case, Moses was not quite as close to God as Cain was. Cain was probably closer to God than any one of us will ever be on this side of heaven. Now Jude compares Cain to Balaam. Balaam was not an Israelite. Nevertheless, it appears that Balaam, like Cain, knew God. In fact, Balaam appears to have been very, very, very close to God. Balaam would talk to God like Cain, and God would talk back. And yet Balaam went astray. It should serve as a warning for us. We might get close to God. We might really genuinely love the Lord. But Jesus said that not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of the Father who is in heaven. That many would come and say, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? In your name have we not done wonderful works? In your name have we not cast out devils? Balaam prophesied in the name of the Lord. Balaam had a donkey speak to him. Balaam had an angel appear to him. The donkey tried to tell Balaam the right way. The angel tried to show Balaam the right way. Balaam saw a vision with his eyes open. What man has had the truth revealed to him more than Balaam has? And yet Balaam tried to turn the children of Israel against God. Balaam said to Balak, the king of Moab, he said, I can't get God to turn against their people, but if you will send your young women near their camp, if you can get their young men or get their men to lust after your young women, you will turn their God against their people. I imagine Balak, the king, might have said, well, Balaam, how will that work? And Balaam might have answered, oh, I know, your gods allow that. Your gods allow that kind of behavior, but their God does not allow it. You send your young women near their camp, and there's the young women to entice their men, and you can get their God to turn against his people, and their God will curse them. It almost worked. Balaam and Cain, two men who were very, very close to God, but who simply refused to obey the simple command. Balaam was told, don't curse my people. Don't try to separate me from my people. He did anyway. Cain was told, don't offer that sacrifice of grain and fruit. He did it anyway. With the result that his sin, the sin of Cain, the sin of Balaam, separated themselves from God.